Hello, my name is Jane Wilkes, and today I want to talk to you about applying empathy to marginalized populations in terms of family involvements in school. First, I'd like to share a little story with you that is about a recent occurrence in my own school district. It Time and time again, Mrs. Smith, not her real name, of course, received numerous phone calls from her son's school about his disruptive behavior in the classroom. Now, this child is an 11-year-old, emotionally disabled black male. And the last phone call Miss Smith got was particularly disturbing because she felt it angered her and it frustrated her because of the harsh punishment that this child was dealt. And she felt like the school was not making any effort to understand the child, nor were they recognizing the fact that this family desperately needed some support to help them with the child. Finally, one day, Miss Smith received a call from, again, it was not the school, it was the district office. And Mrs. Jones, again, not her name, Mrs. Jones said, "Mrs. Smith, I just called to see how you are. I've already talked with the one's teacher, and she tells me that he's adjusting well to his new classroom situation. So really what I called you for is I just want to see how you are. How are you doing?" And Mrs. Smith tearfully said, "You were the first person from that school to be kind to me. You are the first person from that school that's ever acted like they really cared about Dewan or about our family, and for that I thank you." And to make a long story short, now Miss Smith is a frequent visitor in the school system, and she keeps in close, constant communication with Mrs. Jones. Now, how do we all, as educational leaders, show that same empathy for marginalized families? First of all, the necessity and importance of family involvement has long been a source of debate. According to Cousins and Micklin, in a 2011 issue of the Arizona State University's Current Issues in Education, there is little doubt of the positive influence of parent involvement on a child's educational outcome. Now, Dr. Gloria Boutte and Dr. George Johnson Jr. Tell us that some researchers think that the family involvement initiatives are employed by schools to shift the responsibility of a child's academic achievement to the family rather than the school. Gloria Ladson Billings tells us that the chief complaint of teachers is that families don't want to be involved in schools. And this is made, a valid assumption is made there because the 2017 report by the U.S. Department of Education shows us that the extent of family involvement is a legitimate claim, this claim that parents are not that involved, and it's particularly problematic with families of color. Now, the purpose of this talk is to explore different strategies that schools can use to apply empathy in hopes of increasing family involvement and building family-school community relations in an effort to cross racial, cultural, and class boundaries. Now, the significance of this topic is that by increasing this family involvement in schools, we can affirm and even empower some of these marginalized families in their ongoing efforts, in their ways that they can contribute to reduce the disparities that their children face in school each day. Now, this topic will focus on three topics. Number one, what is family involvement? We will look at the traditional and the non-traditional definitions of family involvement, and along with the generational differences. Number two, we'll look at how marginalized families view their relationships with school and explore why they keep their distance from school functions. And number three, we'll look at strategies of how schools can show empathy for these families and increase the family involvement in the school family community relations. Now, first of all, what is family involvement? Traditionally, it's thought of as any involvement where the family member, and I will use that term instead of parent since the main caregiver is not always the parent, but could be a grandparent or an aunt or some other caring person. But the traditional definition is that family involvement takes place whenever one of these family members is present within the school. And this could be at a PTA meeting where they meet face to face with the teacher. It could be at a school program. It could be at a math night, a reading night, a science fair, or some other school-wide function that family members attend. Now, volunteering in the schools is another traditional way of showing family involvement, whether it's volunteering in the classroom or some other place in the school, such as monitoring the hallway, the cafeteria, or the library, and even chaperoning on field trips. That's another form of this traditional family involvement. Now, Dr. Lamar Johnson tells us that African American families and Latino families would demonstrate low rates of family involvement if we view it through this lens. All right, these families, along with lower income families of all races, they are involved in their children's education, but not in the traditional sense, more in an active involvement at home. In other words, they help their children with homework and projects. They talk with their children to discern what's going on in their school experiences. They read any written communications that the school sends, emails or other communications, and try to keep abreast of what's going on. Now, older families didn't used to spend the time and energy that is expected of families nowadays. According to Phil Smith, Williams, and Shoemaker, in the Handbook of Urban Leadership, the children of the 1950s and 1970s, and this is a time before desegregation, did not have their parents come to the school often at all. Mainly they came for PTA or a program that in which their children were participating. They were probably admonished quite often, don't make me come down to that school for your misbehavior. So parents did not frequently come into the school. Now, this expectation is different now, of course. Also, before desegregation, African American families lived in close-knit communities. Their schools were nearby, and all of the families within the community knew the teachers and they knew the other parents and families. And they advocated for every child in that community, not just their own. This same relationship can be seen or was seen in the lower income families who lived in mill villages where the family worked and lived in the mill. The mill was the center of all family life, and in the Deep South these were called mill hills. And they had the same sort of community relationship in these villages, these mill villages, as the African American communities did. One person in the community advocated for everybody's child. In fact, I've heard some of the people of this generation say, I knew that Miss so-and-so, my neighbor, if she saw me doing that she would punish me just like my own mother would. And by the same token, these people went to PTA and they advocated for all children and made sure that all children had the resources they needed and not just their own. And that's quite different nowadays. And the reasons for this, how do families of these marginalized populations feel about their relationships with school now? First of all, most of them don't feel welcome at school. According to Dr. Lamar Johnson and Drs. Boutte and Dr. George Johnson Jr., One reason that teachers sometimes view family involvement from a deficit perspective. And what that means that families are blamed for the academic and social problems of the children. Dr. Gloria Boutte says that urban is not synonymous with deficit, and neither is poor synonymous with deficit. We learn that there's a lack of trust for teachers by marginalized families who don't believe that teachers have the best interest of their children at heart. And that's according to Phil, Smith, Williams, and Shoemaker in the Handbook of Urban Leadership. Also, Hortford and Sutton of UNLV's Lindsay Institute tells us that there are perceptions by educators that Black, Latino, and lower income families don't value education. Many of these families don't volunteer in classrooms like families used to because they fear that if they interact with somebody's child other than their own, that there might be someone who's offended and there could be retribution for this. Other than feeling unwelcome, these parents feel they don't have a voice in school. When they go to PTA meetings, they don't know the other parents there. They don't have relationships with other parents, and they don't feel like these parents and teachers want their input or value their opinions. One of the parents quoted in the Handbook of Urban Leadership states that she went to a PTA meeting and was told they didn't need any more help, so she went home and she's never been back. Many times they feel like the PTA is a waste of their time. Decisions are made by just the few, particularly the affluent white parents. When these families are put on committees, they feel like it's a token position for them. Other reasons that these families feel that they are not needed or are not wanted in schools, or they cannot make family involvement nights, is because of the pressures of real life. For example, they have long work hours. Sometimes they're single parent families. They're burned out. They don't have child care. They don't have transportation. A lot of this is the lower income families that have these problems. Now, how can we as educational leaders, what strategies can we use to alleviate the problems these families have? First of all, to make them feel more welcome, educational leaders need to make a sincere attempt to learn about these families in an authentic way. They need to use the human resources that are invaluable to them, especially from the multi-generational families. They can be used to support learning in so many ways. Educational leaders need to understand the parenting styles of some of these marginalized families. And as Dr. Lamar Johnson tells us, that don't try to assimilate these families into a certain culture. Respect who they are and let them be who they are. Also give them opportunities for their families to meet the parents of the families of their classmates. Have an educational leader present who can facilitate these meetings so that the same chosen few don't monopolize or dominate the conversations there. How can we give these families a voice? Glaringly missing are the voices of those people who the schools hope to involve. Give them an opportunity for input and to discuss or challenge the school experiences of their children. Often these token memberships on these committees by these marginalized families, they know that they're there that the committees don't give them a real voice. Make their voices heard and value their contributions. And last, take the school to the communities. Understand the communities. Go to where the families, where the students live. Understand their communities. Go to their barber shops, their churches, their recreational fields. Study the culture and music and in the magazines. Take the math nights and the reading nights and the PTA to them, and go to a church building or recreational facility or community building and hold these meetings in those areas. Provide them childcare if needed and give them the transportation they need. This is important that schools provide empathy for these marginalized families, and it's imperative that schools equitably respond to those students whose parents do not become involved.